I found at a very early age that most of the partisanship in American politics was nonsense. And I've always felt that way. I was, at the very most, I was a Democrat. At the height of my partisan politics, I was a Democrat or a liberal, but I wasn't really, and would never have voted a straight party ticket. And so when I started in my career talking about this stuff, I would always say that I was not a liberal, that I was a libo, conservo, rado, middle of the roado. Just like most of you, you just haven't given it enough thought lately. And I hold to that to this day. And I think that most, by reducing our politics to this bitter and ignorant partisanship, we do ourselves vast disservices. And we should know better.
I'm Dave Rubin, and joining me today is an Academy Award-winning actor, author of One Thought Scares Me. We teach our children what we wish them to know. We don't teach our children what we don't wish them to know. And a guy with a lot of moxie, Richard Dreyfuss. Welcome to the Rubin Report.
Hiya.
Richard, you do have a lot of moxie. For some reason, that line seemed like the one that I should go to in the intro. I could have gone through about 800 movies. How do you feel about a Lost in Yonkers reference right up top?
For some reason, every bio of me starts out with what a cocky, arrogant guy I am, or was, or something. And I don't agree with it, but I don't, want to start a war. So I let it go. But I think it's just that I tell my truth. I tell the truth. I tell my truth, whether it's anti-Richard or pro-Richard. So, and I think that people are surprised by that. There was an article once about the fact that Barbra Streisand and Richard Dreyfuss were the only two Jews who talked about being Jews and loved it and, didn't expect any bad stuff to come for that. And I know her, and we talked about it, and it never occurred to me not to talk about being Jewish. I was proud of it. And so, but it's the kind of thing that was covered by a lot of fear or a lot of not being candid. Mm-hmm. There were lots of the actors in the earlier years who were Jewish who wouldn't admit it, which I think is kind of silly.
So we could go in all ways to start, but why don't we do a little bio first, because everybody knows you from, obviously, Jaws and Close Encounters and What About Bob, et cetera, et cetera. But can you give me a little bit of a bio, because that'll kind of connect us to the book, because you have a sort of interesting childhood related to politics in terms of where you're at now.
Yeah, I was born in Brooklyn to a very activist family. My great aunt assassinated Tsar Alexander in 1881, an act which I'm very proud of. And my grandmother was a witness to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and walked away from that catastrophe and went directly to the Socialist Party headquarters and volunteered and eventually became Eugene Debs' private secretary. And I have always been their child. and my mother's child. And I once asked my mom, why were you a socialist and not a communist? And she said, better donuts.
Is that a fact?
That's a fact. That's a fact. And we lived in Queens, in an area in Queens which was completely left-wing, completely socialist and communist. And the guy who was the head of the Communist Party on Long Island was a big, fat hospital administrator named David, and he used to tell me stories about what it was like to, be a part of the American Communist Party. And most of the stories dealt in how like and stupid they were. And he's talking as a present-day communist.
Right,
He's like, he thought they were just, that his group was particularly silly. And he was always telling me these stories because this is what America was so frightened of. And my father was asked, my father was not a partisan, and he was asked to run for the Board of Education in Queens. We had crosses burned on our lawn and blah, blah. And so David called an executive cell meeting, and all the top communists in Long Island met at his apartment, and they went downstairs to the basement, and David said, okay, we're here to try to convince Norman Dreyfuss to run for the Board of Education, but it can't be a communist movement, it can't be anything, identified with us, so what do you think? How should we do this? And one guy said, well, I think we should do this, and another guy said we should do that, and then another guy said, well, speaking as a non-communist, I'd like to, and everyone went, what? And they just let him in because he was their pal Stanley, and Stanley walked downstairs with them. And he said that was the thing that everyone was so afraid of in the early 50s. So, and also something that I don't think my father really understood, because my father was the head of a Jewish gang in Brooklyn in the 30s, and every time his father would close the candy store and move a few blocks and reopen it, he had to fight, his gang had to fight the Irish and the Italian gangs. And these were bloody fights, and these were sometimes to the death, like ripping out antennas from cars and sticking them in people's eyes. And this was prior to the war. And then he went to the war with his enemies, and when they came back, and he had a violent war and very dramatic, but when he came back not with enemies, but with brothers, guys who'd been through this experience with him. And I don't think that he realized that his former enemies were now his best friends and neighbors. And I remember talking to one of his friends who was Italian, and I said, I get it. Your totalitarian psychopath is better than his totalitarian psychopath.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I laughed myself sick, and so did he. And he laughed so much that his milk spilled up through his nose. So I found at a very early age that most of the partisanship in American politics was nonsense. And I've always felt that way. I was At the very most, I was a Democrat. At the height of my partisan politics, I was a Democrat or a liberal, but I wasn't really, and would never have voted a straight party ticket. And so when I started in my career talking about this stuff, I would always say that I was not a liberal, that I was a libo, conservo, rado, middle of the roado. Just like most of you, you just haven't given it enough thought lately. And I hold to that to this day. And I think that most, by reducing our politics to this bitter and ignorant partisanship, we do ourselves vast disservices. And we should know better. And nowadays, Republicans or conservatives can't wait to bring up the word liberal as a curse word, and vice versa. Democrats do the same thing with conservatives. And the fact is, none of us are a straight ticket country. We don't do things like that. And we should know more. One of the simple reasons for knowing civics is that you know from the get-go, from the beginning, that opposing views are meant to be cherished. And if you don't, you are missing out on something that is a remarkable strength to our system.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of mindless drivel, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist, all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.